Beneath the dying light of a swollen sun, the sky above Krieg was a vault of muted ash, a place where daylight and night had long since ceased to matter. The surface was a graveyard of forgotten cities, each one reduced to skeletal outlines beneath the endless dust storms that scoured the land. Winds whispered through the shells of ruined towers, carrying the smell of old death mingled with the acrid tang of promethium still seeping from the earth after centuries. Far beyond the horizon, the faint red glow of industrial furnaces could still be seen, remnants of a planet that once fought to live and now existed only to die. In the vaults beneath that broken world, men were raised not to dream, but to obey. They emerged from their subterranean birthplaces as soldiers already sworn to an emperor they would never meet, their lives calculated in terms of service and sacrifice. Here, war was not an interruption of life. It was life itself. It is here that our tale begins, in a place where every sunrise is simply another signal to march towards death. My friends, before we descend fully into the ashes of this world and the hearts of those who fight upon it, know that you are welcome here. You matter to us truly, for stories are nothing without those who listen. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. The transport shuddered as its heavy treads ground over the frozen earth. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and damp cloth. Colonel Erich Stahl sat on the bench beside his men, his greatcoat hanging heavy on his shoulders. His face was a map of pale scars, the skin stretched thin over sharp bones, the product of too many years spent beneath the brutal sun of war-torn worlds. His eyes, a faded grey, stared at the metal floor, not because there was anything to see there, but because it was easier than looking at the soldiers before him, faces so young, so unmarked by the ruin that waited ahead. They were as he had once been, long ago, before the years and the endless campaigns had burned the last embers of hope from him. He had been fighting for longer than he could clearly remember, though his mind still held fragments of Krieg before he left it, glimpses of subterranean chambers lit by cold lamps, the sound of factory hammers echoing through steel corridors, the scent of scorched metal mingled with recycled air. Above all, he remembered the stories whispered between recruits, tales of the great betrayal that had condemned their world centuries before. Krieg had rebelled against the Imperium, and in the purging that followed, its people had embraced death as a penance that would never be fully paid. Every generation since had been raised to see their lives as offerings, each death a coin in a debt without end. The transport jolted to a halt. The ramp hissed open, and the first breath of the outside air hit them, a cold wind laced with ash, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Eric stepped out into a grey wasteland, the sky heavy with low clouds that glowed faintly from the fire of distant bombardments. In the distance, he could see the jagged line of the front, rows of trenches zigzagging through churned earth, barbed wire glistening with frost, the shapes of men moving like shadows between bursts of shell fire. Beyond that lay the enemy, unseen but ever present, their artillery already searching for new victims. As he walked towards the command dugout, the sounds of the battlefield grew clearer, the dull thud of mortars, the crack of lass fire, the occasional scream abruptly cut short. He could feel the weight of every noise pressing into him, the familiar rhythm of war that had become as constant as his own heartbeat. Inside the dugout, dimly lit by a single flickering lumen, he unrolled a stained map across the table. His regiment had been sent here to reinforce the line, to hold until the last man, if need be. It was an order he did not question, not because he believed in it, but because questioning had no place in the life of a son of Krieg. A runner entered, saluting sharply before speaking. The enemy had been pushing hard through the sector to the north, and the regiment would be deployed there at dawn. Eric dismissed him with a nod and leaned over the map, tracing the defensive positions with a gloved finger. He could almost feel the coming battle already, the mud clinging to boots, the acrid smoke choking the air, the taste of blood and powder. Yet somewhere in the cold depths of his mind, another thought lingered, uninvited and unwelcome. How many of his men would see another sunrise after tomorrow? That night, sleep came slowly, if at all. He lay on the cot in the dugout, listening to the muffled detonations above, the shuffling of men preparing for the dawn assault. His mind wandered back to a younger version of himself, one who had believed that dying for the Emperor was the greatest honor a man could claim. That belief had been pure once, untainted by the endless repetition of slaughter. But now, after decades of campaigns across nameless worlds, it had become something different, more ritual than conviction. He still fought, still obeyed, but the fire was gone, replaced by a cold endurance. War was no longer a cause, it was a sentence. In the early hours before dawn, he rose and stepped outside. The air was sharp, the horizon still dark, but he could see the faint glow of artillery flashes in the distance. His men were already assembling in silence, their breath rising in pale clouds. They checked weapons, adjusted gear, moved with the precise efficiency of those who had done this too many times before. There were no speeches, no promises of glory, only the knowledge that soon they would be in the mud, and some would not return. Eric moved among them, nodding to one soldier, adjusting the strap of another's rifle. He could not offer them hope, but he could at least be present. As the first streaks of light broke through the clouds, the order came. The regiment moved out, boots crunching over the frozen ground. Ahead, the world narrowed to the smoke-shrouded trench lines. The sound of heavy guns, the metallic taste of fear and determination mingled. Eric took his place at the front, drawing in one slow breath as they neared the line. He knew the day would carve new scars into them all, if not on their flesh, then on their souls. But he also knew there was no turning away. This was the way of Krieg, to march forward into death without hesitation, without question. And so they did. The snow had begun to fall by the time they returned to the rear line, its quiet descent at odds with the violence that had consumed the dawn. It settled on the helmets and greatcoats of the soldiers as they trudged back, masking the blood and grime, softening the jagged outlines of their exhaustion. Colonel Erich Stahl moved with them, his steps steady, his expression unreadable, but each footfall felt heavier than the last. Around him, the regiment carried its wounded in silence, the only sounds the crunch of boots and the distant, relentless thunder of artillery. War had no victories here, only survivors and the dead. At the field encampment, the men dispersed to their assigned stations without orders, each moving with the same drilled precision as if their bodies had long since memorized the motions. Eric paused at the edge of a tent where stretchers were being laid out in neat rows. The medici worked with cold efficiency, hands steady, even as they cut away ruined cloth and exposed bone. No one cried out, not because there was no pain, but because such displays were unthinkable for the sons of Krieg. The only voice that rose was a hoarse command for more antiseptic, quickly obeyed without question. Eric stepped away, his boots crunching over the frost, until he reached the low canvas tent that served as his quarters. Inside, a single field lamp burned, casting pale light over the sparse furnishings, a folding cot, a battered desk, a rack for his last pistol and saber. On the desk lay the casualty reports from the morning engagement. He sat, the cold metal chair creaking under his weight, and began to read. Each name struck from the roster was accompanied by a number, the designation that had replaced whatever family name or heritage once existed. To anyone else, they were numbers. To him, they were faces. Faces he had seen in the flickering light of trench fires, in the moment before the charge, in the silence after. A shadow fell across the entrance of the tent. Commissar Voss stepped inside, his black greatcoat still dusted with snow, his peaked cap casting a sharp shadow over his eyes. The Emperor was well served today, he said, without preamble. His tone was measured, but Eric could sense the unspoken weight behind the words. Service was never enough. It had to be absolute, without hesitation or doubt. Eric nodded once, keeping his expression neutral. Voss's gaze drifted to the casualty list on the desk. You knew the toll would be high, he continued, but the line held. That is all that matters. Eric let the words hang in the air. There was truth in them, but it was a truth sharpened to a point, one that could cut a man if he lingered on it too long. Yes, Commissar, he replied, the words sounding more like ritual than agreement. When Voss left, Eric remained at the desk, his fingers resting lightly on the list of the dead. He read through the numbers again until one in particular caught his attention. 18744, Private Callan. Barely older than a boy, quiet, but with a steady aim in the field. Eric remembered the way he had adjusted the young soldier's rifle strap that morning, the way the lad had nodded in silent thanks. Now that moment was all that remained. Later that night, the regiment was called to muster for inspection. The cold had deepened, the snow now swirling in heavier sheets. Eric stood before his men, scanning the lines. Their faces were pale in the lamplight, eyes hollow but unflinching. Beside him, Voss delivered the inspection with methodical precision, his gaze like a blade sweeping over each soldier. When it was done, they were dismissed to their stations, their movements as mechanical as the clank of the rifles they carried. After the men had dispersed, Eric lingered in the yard. Captain Reiner, one of his most trusted subordinates, approached from the shadows. The captain was a tall, gaunt man, his face hidden beneath the brim of his helmet. They're holding together, Reiner said quietly, glancing at the barracks where the soldiers filed away. But the new recruits, they're burning out fast. They were never meant to last, Eric replied, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. None of us are. Reiner hesitated before speaking again. Still, they look to you, Colonel, even if they don't show it. Eric didn't answer. Instead, he looked out over the frost-covered ground, past the wire and the watchfires, to where the darkness thickened into the unseen shape of the front. Somewhere out there, the enemy was digging in, preparing for the next assault. He could almost feel the weight of their presence in the cold air. Back in his quarters, Eric removed his greatcoat and sat on the cot. He thought of the men, of their silent endurance, and of the way their numbers would be struck from the roster in the days to come. He wondered if anyone, anywhere, remembered the names they had been born with, or if those too had been buried beneath the ashes of Krieg's penance. The lamp flickered, casting long shadows against the canvas walls. Eric leaned back, closing his eyes. But sleep did not come easily. The snow outside continued to fall, each flake landing without sound, covering the camp in a thin white shroud. It was almost peaceful, if one ignored the truth, that beneath the snow lay mud, and beneath the mud, the bones of those who had marched before. Tomorrow would bring new orders. It always did. The transport's engines whined as it crawled through the mire, treads churning the sodden earth into a thick, black slurry. Rain had been falling for days, turning the battlefield into a vast expanse of sucking mud that swallowed boots to the ankle and dragged at every step. The air reeked of wet soil and old blood, the stench so constant it became part of the very act of breathing. Colonel Erich Stahl sat in the dim, rattling interior, water dripping steadily from a seam in the roof onto the floor between his boots. Across from him sat a line of infantrymen, faces obscured by their rebreathers, eyes dull and unreadable. They did not speak. There was no need. Words were wasted in the moments before the fight. Outside, the distant percussion of artillery grew louder, each blast sending a faint tremor through the hull. The rhythm was uneven, chaotic, yet somehow familiar, like the pulse of a vast, unseen heart driving the war forward. Eric's gloved hand rested on the butt of his sidearm, not out of nervousness, but from habit. He had been in too many deployments to count, yet the leaden stillness before contact always pressed on him the same way. A weight that was not fear, but something colder, heavier. The transport shuddered to a halt. A red light bathed the compartment in its dull glow. Eric rose, the motion unhurried, and signaled to his men. The rear ramp clanked open, and the world outside rushed in. Rain, wind, and the constant roar of battle. They stepped into knee-deep mud, the sky above a low ceiling of smoke and cloud lit by the flash of guns. Ahead lay the trenches, jagged scars in the earth, their parapets crowned with barbed wire, slick with water. The smell of promethium drifted from somewhere close by, faint but sharp. They moved forward in silence, boots squelching in the mire, until they reached the nearest communication trench. The walls here were reinforced with warped planks, but the mud seeped through regardless, running in thin streams down into the water pooled at their feet. Soldiers were already crouched along the firing step, their rifles resting on the parapet, eyes fixed on the shifting grey beyond. Eric passed among them, checking positions, exchanging brief nods. A few of the newer men stiffened at his presence, though the veterans barely glanced his way. Respect was not shown here in words or salutes. It was measured in how a man held his ground when the sky fell in. At the far end of the line, Commissar Voss waited beneath a makeshift canopy of corrugated steel. His cap was pulled low, the rain beading on its surface before dripping from the brim. "They'll test this sector before nightfall," he said, without looking up from his map. "Your men will hold. There will be no retreat." "There never is," Eric replied. His voice was flat, but his gaze lingered on the map. The enemy's positions were close, too close. It would be a matter of hours before they pushed forward. The first shells began to fall in the early afternoon, great plumes of mud and water erupting from the no-man's land between the lines. The ground shook beneath each impact, the air filling with the thunder of the barrage. Men crouched low in the trench, shoulders hunched, waiting for the signal to return fire. Eric moved along the line, his voice steady as he called out adjustments, shifting men to cover weaker points. When the assault came, it was sudden, the enemy advancing through the smoke with bayonets fixed, their figures flickering in and out of view like wraiths. Lasfire cut the mist, each shot snapping through the air with a sharp crack. Eric took his place on the firing step, his rifle braced against the parapet, sighting and firing in a measured rhythm. Around him, the regiment fought with grim precision, their movements drilled into instinct by years of ceaseless training. The mud clung to everything: boots, weapons, even the dead, whose bodies slumped into the mire, sinking slowly as the rain continued to fall. The noise was overwhelming. The roar of the guns, the hiss of last fire, the wet thud of bodies hitting the earth. Somewhere to his left, a cry rang out, brief and sharp, before being drowned by the chaos. Hours passed in fragments. Reload, fire, move. Reload, fire, move. By the time the attack faltered and the enemy withdrew, the trench was half collapsed in places, the floor slick with blood and water. The survivors stood in silence, breathing heavily through their masks, the only sound the steady patter of rain. Eric lowered his weapon, scanning the line. Too many gaps. As dusk fell, he made his way to a small dugout carved into the trench wall. Inside, a single lantern lit the cramped space. Captain Rayner was there, stripping and cleaning his rifle. "They won't wait long before trying again," he said, without looking up. "They never do," Eric replied, sinking onto a wooden crate. His gloves were soaked through, his greatcoat heavy with water and mud. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to block out the lantern light. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the young ones again, their wide, untested eyes when they'd stepped from the transport that morning. He wondered how many of those eyes were now closed forever, hidden beneath the rain and mud of the no man's land. Outside, the guns began again, slower this time, probing the line. The sound was almost like breathing, long, deep, unending. Eric opened his eyes and reached for his rifle. The night would be long. The morning air was thick with smoke and the scent of wet cordite, clinging to everything it touched. The trench walls, the mud-soaked boots, even the skin beneath the heavy greatcoats of the soldiers. Colonel Eric Stahl emerged from the dugout, the weight of the previous day pressing into his shoulders like an invisible burden. His eyes swept over the line where the survivors huddled in silence, exhausted but unbroken. They were men shaped by constant sacrifice, their movements precise despite the lingering cold and the pervasive stench of decay. The dead lay where they had fallen, partially submerged in the sludge, their helmets tilted at unnatural angles. Eric's gaze lingered briefly on one figure, a young soldier he had seen steady and focused during the assault, now still in the mud, as if even the rain itself could not wash away the permanence of his absence. He stepped past the body, forcing himself not to look back, for Krieg's sons knew that dwelling on the fallen was a dangerous luxury. Survival required the mind to remain unclouded, even if the heart carried its own private reckoning. By mid-morning, the regiment was ordered to consolidate their position. Engineers moved along the trench line, shoring up weak points with sandbags and timber, while medicae worked frantically to patch the wounded before the next enemy push. Eric walked among them, noting the careful precision of their work. Each man acted as though instinct alone guided him, yet he could sense the silent calculation behind every movement, the effort to maintain order in a world that offered none. A voice called from the trench's far end. It was Private Callan's replacement, a thin-faced youth whose eyes still held a spark of something not yet extinguished by the endless campaigns. "Colonel," he said, approaching carefully, "some of the men, they're talking about the last battle, about why we fight." Eric's expression remained neutral, though inside he felt the stirrings of the same questions he had buried for decades. "And what are they saying?" he asked quietly. They wonder if Krieg truly serves the Emperor, or if we're just tools. That maybe we're wasting our lives on orders that belong to someone else." He looked at the boy, noting the tremor in his voice, the hesitation behind his words. He did not answer immediately. There was no simple truth he could give. The question had haunted him since he had first donned the black armor. Loyalty was not just obedience. It was sacrifice, endurance, and the willingness to bear a burden no one else could understand. And yet, even he had begun to wonder if the burden itself had lost its meaning. The day dragged on with a relentless rhythm. Patrols were sent into the quagmire of no man's land, only to return hours later, mud-splattered and silent, bearing reports of enemy movements or the bodies of the missing. Eric spent hours examining the trench network, marking vulnerable points, calculating where his men might be most exposed. Each measurement, each decision, carried with it the weight of countless lives. As night fell, the rain turned to sleet, hammering down on the trench roofs and running in icy streams through the mud. Soldiers huddled together wherever they could find shelter, sharing the warmth of their bodies in silent solidarity. In the corner of one dugout, a group of young recruits whispered nervously, their voices barely audible over the wind. They spoke of home worlds, of families long forgotten, of dreams that could not survive the reality around them. Eric listened from a few steps away, noting each word, each expression, though he said nothing. To intervene was unnecessary. Experience alone would teach them what the cold truth could not. Late into the night, he found himself at the edge of the trench, staring across the flat, sodden expanse toward the distant flashes of enemy artillery. The horizon was broken only by jagged remnants of destroyed fortifications, the skeletal remains of trees, and the intermittent glow of explosions. For a moment, he imagined it as a vast chessboard, the men and machines little more than pawns in an endless game whose rules had been written long before their lives began. The thought was fleeting, for Krieg's sons did not dwell on abstractions. They acted, endured, and survived, even if the soul beneath the armor was quietly eroding. A sudden shout snapped him from his reverie. A patrol returning from the forward line had discovered something unexpected. A cluster of enemy survivors huddled in the ruins of a collapsed bunker. They were few, but they carried information, plans for a renewed offensive, orders that could bring the regiment under threat before dawn. Eric quickly gathered his officers and studied the details, the maps illuminated by a dim lantern. Each calculation, each possible response, felt like a prelude to another wave of loss. Hours later, as the sleet eased into fine rain, he walked among his men again, offering terse words of instruction and encouragement. Some returned nods, others did not. Their faces were pale, streaked with mud and exhaustion, eyes hollow yet unyielding. Eric realized then that these men were not defined by victories or defeats, but by their persistence, the quiet, unending commitment to continue, even when hope was a memory long extinguished. By midnight, the camp had fallen silent, save for the occasional roar of distant artillery. Eric sat in his quarters, hands folded over the map of the sector. He thought of the enemy survivors, of the young recruits' whispered dreams, and of the men who would not see another sunrise. In Krieg, death was not sudden. It was a constant companion, walking beside every soldier, whispering questions that could not be answered. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of command settle deeper into his bones, knowing that tomorrow would demand the same endurance, the same vigilance, and the same sacrifices. Outside, the trench line shivered beneath the wind. Somewhere beyond the mud and the rain, the enemy moved, silent and relentless. Eric inhaled deeply, letting the cold seep into him, steadying his resolve. The war would not end, not while he drew breath. And still, in the quiet moments before dawn, he could not help but feel the stirring of doubt, an echo of questions that would not leave him, even in the endless march of Krieg. The sky above the trench line was a uniform grey, heavy with clouds that threatened snow, carrying the chill that gnawed at fingers and toes alike. Colonel Erich Stahl walked along the parapet, boots sinking into the wet earth, watching as the soldiers checked their weapons with meticulous care. Each man moved with a precision born of routine, but their eyes betrayed the strain of unending campaigns. The young ones, especially, seemed to tremble beneath the weight of expectation and fear, their faces pale and drawn beneath mud-streaked helmets. The regiment had been in the line for days without respite, and yet the orders remained the same. Hold. Do not falter. Do not retreat. Erich had long ago stopped questioning the logic behind commands. Krieg's sons did not seek reason. They sought survival through obedience and through the grim satisfaction of having executed their duty without hesitation. A messenger arrived, breaking the monotony of inspection. He handed Erich a folded document, sodden at the edges from the rain. Unfolding it, Erich scanned the lines quickly. Enemy movements had intensified. Intelligence suggested that an assault was imminent, larger than any they had yet faced. The document bore annotations, positions, strengths, likely objectives. Erich's eyes narrowed. Every line represented lives he was responsible for, and every potential loss pressed down on him with the weight of inevitability. By midday, the soldiers were on high alert. Patrols moved forward cautiously, boots sloshing in mud-filled craters, scanning for movement in the grey haze. Erich walked among them, observing, guiding, silently noting who held firm and who wavered. The fear was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he could sense it in the slight hesitation of hands, the quick flinches at distant explosions, the tight clenching of teeth behind respirators. He paused beside Private Heller, a young recruit who had already faced his first skirmish and survived. Heller's eyes met his, searching for reassurance. Erich placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tension there. "Steady yourself," he said softly. "Do not look for what is to come. Only do what is required, and do not falter." The afternoon passed in tense quiet. From the horizon, plumes of smoke marked the movements of enemy artillery, and occasional bursts of lance fire lit the grey landscape in stark, fleeting brilliance. Erich observed the enemy's rhythm, calculating the intervals between bombardments, the points of weakness in their advance. Every piece of information mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. As evening fell, the first volleys of the assault struck with brutal force. The ground shook beneath the trench, and mud sprayed in clods as shells detonated nearby. Soldiers scrambled for cover, rifles raised, eyes wide beneath their helmets. Erich moved along the line, issuing commands with sharp brevity, redirecting squads to plug gaps, shouting over the din of explosions. The enemy pressed hard, relentless in their advance. Yet the regiment held, their movements tight, precise, disciplined. Hours later, after the assault ebbed, the trench line was a tableau of exhaustion. Men slumped where they stood, mud-caked and panting, eyes hollow from the strain. Erich moved among them silently, offering no words of comfort, only presence. Each survivor was a testament to endurance, each loss a reminder of the cost of obedience. In the quiet that followed, Erich allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought of the young recruits, their fleeting glimmers of hope, now tempered by the realities of Krieg. He thought of the fallen, their lives etched into the mud and snow, never to return. And he thought of the relentless machinery of war, which demanded persistence, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. As night closed over the battlefield, Eric stood at the parapet once more, gazing across the broken expanse. Somewhere beyond the haze, the enemy regrouped, preparing for the next push. He inhaled the cold air, feeling the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again, and he would be there to see it through, as always, until the world itself seemed to bend under the endless march of Krieg's sons. The air in the forward trenches had turned bitter with frost. The mud beneath boots now hardened into jagged sheets that cracked with each step. Colonel Erich Stahl moved through the line with the quiet authority that had become second nature, eyes scanning the soldiers who crouched along the parapets, faces pale and taut under the strain of relentless vigilance. The last assault had taken its toll. The men were weary, their movements slower, their eyes haunted by memories of comrades who would not see another sunrise. Eric paused at a section of trench where the young recruits clustered, whispering quietly to one another. Their voices were almost imperceptible above the wind and distant thunder of guns, but he could hear the tremor in their tones, the way fear laced each word. He knelt briefly, resting a hand on the shoulder of one pale-faced boy. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said quietly. "It is endurance in spite of it. You are Krieg's sons now. Remember this." A messenger arrived, sodden from the frozen rain, bearing new orders. Eric read them quickly, scanning the details with practiced efficiency. The enemy had shifted their positions, probing weak points along the regiment's line. A coordinated attack was imminent, and the weight of command pressed down heavier than the cold itself. Every number on the report represented a life he could not afford to lose, and yet knew he might. The day passed in tense preparation. Soldiers reinforced, parapets, checked rifles, and rechecked ammunition. The medici moved tirelessly among the wounded, their hands steady despite the growing list of casualties. Eric oversaw every operation, but he felt the creeping fatigue in his own limbs, the slow erosion of the endurance that had once seemed unbreakable. Even the soldiers of Krieg, trained to embrace suffering, were mortal in their limits. By dusk, the enemy's artillery began to fall again, shaking the ground and sending showers of ice and mud into the trenches. Soldiers braced themselves, hands gripping rifles, eyes fixed on the blurred horizon. Eric moved along the line, issuing commands, adjusting squads to cover gaps, offering terse encouragement where it was needed. Each moment was a battle in itself, a test of will against exhaustion, fear, and the unyielding reality of war. As night fell, the enemy's assault began. Figures moved through the smoke, advancing with calculated precision. Lasfire streaked through the grey, lighting the trench line in fleeting flashes of brilliance. Eric was everywhere at once, observing, commanding, correcting, and fighting alongside his men. The trench became a crucible of endurance, each soldier tested against the relentless tide. When the attack subsided, the regiment held, but at tremendous cost. Mud and blood clung to boots and uniforms, and the line was punctuated by the still forms of the fallen. Eric surveyed the scene with a hollow weight in his chest. Victory had been earned, but at a price that no tally of lives could ever measure. In the aftermath, the regiment began recovery operations. Bodies were retrieved, wounds treated, and positions reinforced. Eric walked among the soldiers, noting the silent exchanges, the brief moments of connection between men who had endured together. He understood that their strength lay not in orders, but in shared sacrifice, in the bond forged through endless hardship. Late into the night, he retreated to his tent, stripping away the wet layers of his greatcoat and armor. He sat at the table, staring at the maps and reports, but his mind wandered to the men, to the young recruits, to the ones who would not see another dawn. The quiet moments were the hardest, when the weight of command pressed deepest, when the faces of the dead appeared unbidden in memory. Eric leaned back, hands folded, and listened to the wind whip across the battlefield. Somewhere beyond the trench line, the enemy moved and planned, preparing for the next cycle of death. He inhaled slowly, letting the cold seep into him, steadying himself. The war would not end, not while he lived, not while Krieg demanded its sons march forward without pause. And still, in the deepest part of his mind, doubt lingered. The whisper of questions that could not be answered. The ghost of hope that perhaps one day the cycle might break. But for now, there was only the trench, the mud, the blood, and the relentless march of Krieg's sons. The horizon was jagged with smoke and fire, a blackened scar across a sky that had forgotten the warmth of the sun. Colonel Erich Stahl stood atop the parapet, observing the no-man's land beyond the trench line, where shattered trees and twisted metal littered the frozen earth. The ground was churned into a quagmire of mud and blood, every footprint a record of death, every crater a reminder of lives lost. His breath steamed in the cold air, each exhale a ghost against the grey sky, as the distant rumble of artillery reminded him that the war never ceased. It only paused to gather its fury. The regiment had been repositioned after the last assault, their lines shorter but more defensible. Engineers worked feverishly to reinforce the parapets with timber and sandbags, while medicae moved swiftly among the wounded. Soldiers patrolled the edge of the trench, rifles scanning the fog-laden expanse, eyes wary, bodies tense. Erich moved among them, silent and watchful, a sentinel over men whose endurance was being tested in ways no training could fully prepare them for. A sudden flare lit the eastern sky. Through the glare, figures emerged, enemy forces probing the line, testing their defenses. Eric's hand went to his sidearm, but he did not fire. Observation was the first tool, knowledge before action. The enemy moved methodically, almost ritualistically, a shadowed reflection of the discipline that Krieg demanded from its sons. "Colonel," Captain Rayner's voice called, cutting through the wind. "They're advancing in formation, small squads, flanking the eastern sector." Eric's eyes narrowed. The eastern sector had been vulnerable, the mud and ice making rapid movement nearly impossible. "Prepare the men," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Concentrate fire, hold the line at all costs." The first shots rang out, lass fire streaking across the grey, illuminating faces tense with concentration. Explosions erupted nearby, throwing mud and frozen earth into the trench. Soldiers shouted, ducked, and returned fire in disciplined rhythm, each action honed by years of practice, each movement a testament to the regiment's unyielding resolve. As the skirmish unfolded, Eric moved along the parapet, issuing commands and adjusting squads, his presence both reassurance and steel. He passed Private Heller, who crouched in the mud, eyes wide and trembling. "Focus on your breathing," Eric said quietly. "Do not let the fear control you. You are Krieg's son. Remember that." Hours passed in a blur of fire and motion. The enemy's assault faltered and resumed, their figures emerging and retreating like shadows cast by a flickering light. Each volley of las fire, each shell, each fallen comrade weighed on Eric, yet he could not falter. Leadership demanded a steadiness he did not always feel, a calm he sometimes had to summon from the depths of exhaustion. Midway through the engagement, a shockwave hit the trench, throwing soldiers to the ground and filling the air with the acrid scent of burning promethium. Eric struggled to maintain balance, his ears ringing as mud and splinters showered around him. When the dust settled, He counted the casualties quickly, noting the gaps in the line and the need for immediate reinforcement. Commissar Voss appeared at the edge of the trench, his presence like a shadowed weight pressing down. "They test us because they believe we will break," he said, voice calm but sharp. "They will learn their mistake." Eric nodded. He did not respond with words, for speech was unnecessary. Action was required. Orders were given, squads moved into position, and the regiment held, enduring another wave of the enemy's relentless advance. As dusk fell, the firing subsided. The trench line was battered, mud and blood coating the walls, bodies both living and dead strewn across the parapet. Eric moved slowly along the line, surveying the men. Their faces were pale and drawn, but their eyes held a hard glint, the quiet fire of those who had survived and would continue to do so. He stopped at the edge of a collapsed section of trench, where young recruits had fought side by side with veterans. One of them, barely more than a boy, looked up at him with wide, haunted eyes. Eric knelt, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You fought well today," he said softly. "Remember this strength. Carry it forward, no matter the cost." Night descended, bringing with it a cold wind that cut through the trench line. Soldiers huddled in whatever shelter they could find, tending wounds and preparing for what the enemy would bring next. Eric retreated to his own quarters, boots heavy with mud and heart heavy with the weight of command. He examined the maps and reports again, noting the positions of the enemy and the vulnerabilities of his own lines. Every decision carried the burden of countless lives, every choice the shadow of mortality. He thought of the young soldiers, of their whispered fears and quiet determination. He thought of the dead, lying unseen beneath the mud and ice. And he thought of Krieg itself, a regiment forged in endless war, bound by duty, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will. As he closed his eyes, he understood that tomorrow would bring more fire, more mud, more loss. Yet the regiment would endure as it always had, driven by loyalty, discipline, and the silent hope that their persistence might one day tip the scales. In the darkness, he could hear the distant rumble of engines, the promise of another wave. And he knew, as always, he would be there to meet it, standing amid the mud, the blood, and the unending storm. The battlefield lay shrouded in an unending grey, a frozen wasteland scarred by fire, mud, and the echoes of countless deaths. Colonel Erich Stahl moved through the trenches with careful deliberation, boots crunching against the frozen earth, eyes scanning every shadow and every movement beyond the parapets. The men were weary, faces pale beneath mud-smeared respirators, but still they moved with disciplined precision, the weight of their endurance carrying them through another day in Krieg's endless war. Reports from the forward patrols arrived in quick succession, detailing enemy maneuvers that had grown more daring with each passing hour. Small squads probed the line, testing the regiment's responses, seeking weakness in the black-coated sons of Krieg. Eric read each report, noting the positions, the timing, the repeated patterns. Every detail mattered. A single mistake could cost dozens of lives. He issued orders with measured calm, his words sharp but concise, each command carrying the authority of a man who had survived countless battles. The first artillery strikes of the morning thundered across the landscape, sending sprays of mud and ice into the trenches. Soldiers crouched low, rifles ready, hearts synchronized with the rhythm of the bombardment. Eric moved among them, checking positions, adjusting squads, and lending a silent reassurance that only presence could convey. Even in the midst of chaos, discipline was their shield, and Krieg's sons wielded it with precision. By midday, the enemy launched a coordinated assault, advancing through smoke and shattered terrain, with bayonets fixed and laser guns firing in disciplined rhythm. Eric took his place on the parapet, observing the advance, issuing rapid commands to counterflank, redirect fire, and reinforce weakened sections. The trench line became a crucible of endurance, each soldier tested against fear, fatigue, and the unyielding relentlessness of war. Amid the battle, Eric's mind drifted briefly to the young recruits. One in particular, a pale-faced boy who had survived his first engagement only hours before, now crouched with trembling hands gripping a rifle far too large for his frame. Eric moved to his side, lowering his voice over the din of gunfire. "Steady yourself. Let your training guide you, not fear. You are Krieg's sons. Remember that." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, and returned his focus to the approaching enemy, determination flickering in his eyes like a fragile flame. The afternoon passed in a blur of fire and motion. Las fire lanced through the grey, explosions shook the trenches, and soldiers fell, some never to rise again. Eric worked tirelessly, moving from squad to squad, issuing orders, correcting formations, and sometimes silently mourning the ones who had fallen. Each life lost was a weight upon him, a reminder of the cost of command in a war that recognized no mercy. As evening approached, the enemy's advance faltered under the unyielding discipline of Krieg's regiment. Mud-slicked trenches held, and the enemy withdrew into the smoke and haze of the no-man's land. The survivors of the line gathered, breathing heavily, bodies coated in mud and blood. Eric surveyed the scene, noting the exhaustion etched into every face, the quiet pride of endurance that transcended fear. Night descended, heavy and cold. Soldiers tended to wounds, reinforced positions, and whispered quietly to one another, seeking solace in shared suffering. Eric retreated to his tent, boots thick with mud, greatcoat soaked through, and hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. He studied the maps and reports, tracing enemy movements, calculating the next wave of attack, knowing that the battle was far from over. Yet even in the cold, dark hours, doubts gnawed at him. He thought of the young recruits, of the men who had fallen, of the endless cycle of death and duty that defined Krieg. Loyalty and discipline were their shield, but even the strongest steel could bend under enough weight. He inhaled the frigid air, letting it steady him, focusing on the present, on the men who depended on him, on the next moment, the next order, the next action. Outside, the wind howled across the battlefield, carrying with it the echoes of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the relentless drumbeat of war. Eric closed his eyes, feeling the burden of command settle even deeper into his bones. Tomorrow would bring more blood, more mud, and more sacrifice. And still he would stand, leading his men through the storm, because Krieg demanded it, because survival required it, and because he could do nothing else. The night stretched on, endless, unyielding, a prelude to the next day's trial, and the trenches waited, silent but vigilant, for the war that would never truly end. The dawn broke over the battlefield with a muted steel-grey light, the sky heavy with clouds and the promise of another merciless day. Colonel Erich Stahl moved along the trench line, boots sinking into frozen mud that had hardened overnight, each step a reminder of the relentless toll of Krieg's campaigns. The men were already awake, checking weapons, reinforcing parapets, and whispering in low voices. Their faces were pale and drawn, eyes hollow with fatigue, yet hardened by the discipline that had sustained them through unending war. Reports came quickly from the forward posts. Enemy activity had intensified overnight, probing the eastern flank with stealthy patrols and occasional bursts of las fire. Intelligence suggested that a major offensive was being prepared, and Eric's mind raced through possible responses. Each decision weighed heavily, for every order could mean life or death for dozens of soldiers under his command. He stopped beside a squad of young recruits, their rifles clutched tightly, knuckles white beneath mud-caked gloves. One of them, barely more than a boy, met his gaze with wide eyes, unspoken questions lingering in the tremor of his posture. Eric knelt briefly, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Courage is not the absence of fear," he said quietly. "It is endurance in spite of it. You are Krieg's sons. Remember that, and survive." By mid-morning, the enemy's artillery began hammering the line, shaking the frozen ground and sending clouds of mud and ice into the trenches. Soldiers pressed themselves against the walls, rifles ready, hearts synchronized with the rhythm of the bombardment. Eric moved among them, adjusting positions, issuing commands with precision, and lending silent reassurance through his presence alone. Discipline was their armor, and Krieg's sons wielded it like a weapon. As the day progressed, the first wave of infantry attacks hit with calculated ferocity. Figures emerged through the smoke and debris, advancing with bayonets fixed and lasguns firing in tight formation. Eric stood atop the parapet, issuing rapid commands to counterflank, plug gaps, and reinforce weakened sections. The trench line became a crucible of endurance, each man tested against fear, fatigue, and the unyielding inevitability of war. Amid the chaos, Eric's thoughts drifted to the losses already endured. Faces of the fallen flashed before him, the young recruits who had never seen more than mud and blood, the seasoned veterans who had fought and died alongside him. Each life lost was a weight pressing on his shoulders, a reminder of the cost of obedience and the burden of command. By late afternoon, the enemy's assault faltered, but not before leaving the regiment battered and exhausted. Mud and blood-coated uniforms, parapets bore the scars of repeated bombardment, and the trench floor was littered with both the living and the dead. Eric walked among the survivors, noting the grim determination etched into their faces, the quiet pride that came from having endured when others had fallen. Night fell with a chilling wind that cut through the trench like a blade. Soldiers huddled together wherever they could find shelter, tending wounds, sharing whispered words of solace, and reinforcing the parapets for the next inevitable assault. Eric retreated to his tent, boots heavy with mud and armor slick with blood and rain. He reviewed maps and reports, tracing enemy positions and planning responses, aware that the night was only a temporary reprieve in an endless cycle of war. In the stillness of his tent, doubts surfaced. The young recruits, the dead, the endless orders and counter-orders. They pressed on him with a suffocating weight. Loyalty and discipline sustained the regiment, but even the strongest resolve could be tested beyond endurance. He inhaled sharply, drawing the cold air into his lungs, and allowed himself a single moment to remember why they fought. Not for glory, not for victory, but because Krieg demanded it, and survival depended on their unbroken will. The wind whispered through the shattered landscape outside, carrying with it the distant echoes of artillery, the groans of the wounded, and the steady drumbeat of a war that never ended. Eric closed his eyes, letting the weight of command settle deep into his bones, knowing that tomorrow would bring more death, more mud, and more sacrifice. And still he would rise with the dawn leading his men through the storm, because there was no other path, and because Krieg's sons could endure what the world could not. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, dull and grey, casting long shadows across the scarred battlefield. Colonel Erich Stahl moved along the trench line, boots sinking into frozen mud, the cold biting through his greatcoat. The regiment was weary but unbroken, each soldier a testament to the endurance and discipline that defined Krieg. Their eyes, pale and hollow, betrayed the constant weight of war, yet the rigid precision of their movements belied any hint of hesitation. Reports from forward scouts came in with increasing urgency. Enemy forces had reorganized overnight, their positions shifting, probing the flanks with greater daring than before. Intelligence suggested a coordinated offensive designed to breach the eastern trench sector. Erich read the reports quickly, scanning lines of numbers and positions, calculating probabilities with meticulous care. Each detail could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. Each decision weighed heavily with the responsibility of command. He passed along the line, observing the soldiers preparing for the impending assault. Medici worked tirelessly, dressing wounds and reinforcing bandages, while engineers strengthened parapets and repaired damaged sections. The men moved with practiced precision, every action deliberate, yet Erich could sense the undercurrent of fatigue pressing against their discipline. Survival required endurance, but endurance alone could not shield the mind from the constant toll of battle. By midday, the first artillery shells began to fall, shaking the ground and sending showers of mud and ice into the trenches. Soldiers pressed against the walls, rifles ready, eyes scanning the horizon. Erich moved along the line, issuing orders to counterflank, reposition squads, and prepare for enemy infantry advances. His presence, calm and commanding, provided reassurance in the chaos, a stabilizing force amidst the storm of fire and motion. The enemy advanced, figures emerging through smoke and debris, bayonets fixed, laser guns firing in disciplined waves. Erich directed the regiment with swift precision, coordinating volleys of las fire, reinforcing weak points, and adjusting tactics to match the enemy's movements. Each clash was a test of endurance and will, a crucible that pushed every soldier to the edge of their physical and mental limits. Amid the assault, Erich's thoughts drifted briefly to the young recruits, some barely more than boys, now facing the unrelenting horrors of combat. He knelt beside one trembling figure, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Focus," he whispered. "Let your training guide you. Fear is natural, but discipline will carry you through. You are Krieg's sons." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, gripping his rifle with renewed determination, and returned to the line. Hours passed in a blur of motion and fire. Shells exploded across the frozen landscape, mud and blood mixing in the trenches, and soldiers fell beside each other, some never to rise again. Erich moved tirelessly among them, issuing commands, plugging gaps, and lending silent reassurance through his presence alone. Each life lost added weight to his shoulders, each successful defense a temporary balm against the relentless tide of destruction. As dusk approached, the enemy's attack faltered under the regiment's steadfast discipline. The trench line, though battered and bloodied, held firm. Soldiers tended wounds, reinforced positions, and quietly mourned the fallen. Erich walked among them, noting the exhaustion etched into every face, the quiet pride in having endured another day of relentless trial. Night descended with a bitter wind that cut through trenches and tents alike. Soldiers huddled together, sharing warmth and whispered words of solace, while Erich retreated to his quarters. He reviewed maps and reports, tracing enemy movements, recalculating positions, and preparing for the next inevitable assault. Even in the solitude of his tent, doubts gnawed at him. Questions of purpose, of the cost of loyalty, of the lives claimed by the endless demands of Krieg. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the echoes of distant artillery and the cries of wounded soldiers. Eric closed his eyes, feeling the burden of command settle deep into his bones. Tomorrow would bring more blood, more mud, more loss. Yet he would rise again, as he always had, leading his men through the storm. For Krieg demanded endurance, and the sons of Krieg did not falter, even when the world itself seemed determined to break them. The battlefield awoke under a heavy sky, clouds churning like the foreboding thoughts in Colonel Erich Stahl's mind. The trenches, still slick with frozen mud and blood from previous assaults, smelled of iron and smoke, a bitter perfume of war that clung to the regiment like a second skin. Soldiers moved with mechanical precision, faces pale beneath mud-streaked respirators, eyes hollow yet unwavering. The weight of endless combat had etched lines into their expressions, yet the discipline of Krieg endured, unyielding, as immutable as the frozen earth beneath their boots. Reports arrived from scouts positioned along the eastern flank. The enemy had shifted their formations again, probing for weaknesses, testing the regiment's endurance. Eric studied each message meticulously, tracing movements across maps marked with frost and blood. Every line represented lives under his command, every symbol a decision that could mean survival or death. The responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he bore it silently, knowing that hesitation in Krieg's sons was a luxury no one could afford. He walked among the soldiers, observing, adjusting, and guiding. Medici treated the wounded with tireless hands, their faces calm masks over the exhaustion threatening to seep into every corner of the trenches. Engineers reinforced parapets with sandbags and timber, shoring up weak points against the inevitable assault. Recruits, trembling and pale, followed the movements of veterans, absorbing each order, each gesture, learning the unspoken lessons of endurance and survival. By midday, the first signs of enemy activity became undeniable. Artillery shells rained down, shaking the ground, tearing clods of frozen earth into the air. Lass fire streaked across the trenches, illuminating faces strained with fear and determination. Eric moved along the line, issuing orders, repositioning squads, and reinforcing exposed sections. Discipline was their shield, endurance their weapon, and every soldier responded with practiced precision, even as the toll of relentless war pressed against their resolve. The enemy advanced in waves, emerging from smoke and debris, bayonets gleaming and laser guns firing in disciplined volleys. Eric directed his regiment with exacting precision, ensuring that every weak point was covered, every maneuver calculated to withstand the onslaught. Soldiers fought with grim determination, every shot and every movement a testament to the unbroken will of Krieg's sons. Amid the chaos, Eric remained a steady presence, moving among them, lending reassurance and authority in equal measure. In the midst of the fighting, his thoughts turned to the younger soldiers. A recruit, barely more than a boy, crouched trembling behind the parapet, eyes wide with fear. Eric knelt, resting a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Focus on your training," he said quietly. "Let discipline guide you. Fear is natural, but it cannot control you. You are Krieg's sons. Remember that." The boy swallowed hard, nodding, and returned to his post with a flicker of resolve shining through the terror. Hours bled into each other as the engagement continued. Shells exploded with brutal regularity. Mud and blood mixed across the trench floor, and men fell beside each other, some never to rise again. Eric moved tirelessly, issuing commands, plugging gaps, and silently mourning the losses, each one a reminder of the price of duty. Yet amidst the horror, moments of bravery and loyalty shone like flickers of light against the grey and mud. Small acts that bound the regiment together, sustaining them even as exhaustion and despair threatened to overtake their spirits. As dusk fell, the enemy's advance finally slowed, their assaults repelled, though the trench line bore the scars of the relentless attacks. Soldiers tended wounds, reinforced defenses, and shared quiet words of solace. Eric moved among them, noting the exhaustion etched into every face, the muted pride that came from having endured another day of endless trial. Night descended with a bitter, cutting wind. Soldiers huddled where they could, some sharing warmth, others quietly reflecting on the day's losses. Eric retreated to his tent, boots heavy with mud, armor streaked with dried blood. He pored over maps and reports, tracing enemy movements, recalculating positions, preparing for the next inevitable assault. Even in solitude, doubts gnawed at him. The cost of loyalty, the lives claimed by duty, the shadow of fear for the young men under his command. Outside, the wind carried the distant echoes of artillery, the groans of the wounded, and the unending cadence of war. Eric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of command settle deep into his bones. Tomorrow would bring more mud, more blood, more sacrifice. And still he would rise, leading his men through the storm, because Krieg demanded it, because the sons of Krieg did not falter, and because to cease was to betray everything they had endured. The horizon burned with a dull, red glow, as the first shells of dawn rumbled across the battlefield, shaking frozen earth and stirring clouds of smoke into the grey sky. Colonel Erich Stahl moved along the trench line, boots crunching through mud thickened by frost and blood, eyes scanning every shadow that flickered across the scarred terrain. The regiment stirred in quiet readiness, soldiers adjusting rifles, checking ammunition, and whispering in muted tones. Faces were pale and drawn, eyes hollow yet resolute, the unyielding discipline of Krieg etched into every movement. Reports came swiftly from forward posts. Enemy forces had regrouped overnight, their formations shifting with deliberate intent, probing weak points along the line. The intelligence suggested an imminent coordinated assault, one designed to break the eastern trenches and strike at the heart of the regiment. Eric read each report with meticulous care, tracing movements across maps streaked with mud and blood. Every line represented lives under his command, every symbol a decision that could mean survival or death. He walked among the soldiers, observing, adjusting, and offering quiet reassurance. Medicae worked tirelessly, tending to wounds with steady hands, while engineers reinforced parapets, shoring up sections weakened by previous engagements. Recruits followed veterans closely, absorbing instructions and gestures, learning the unspoken lessons of endurance and survival, their fear tempered by the rigid training of Krieg. By mid-morning, the enemy's artillery opened with brutal precision, shaking the ground and tearing clods of frozen earth into the air. Lasfire streaked across the trenches, illuminating faces tight with concentration and terror. Eric moved along the parapets, issuing rapid commands to counterflank, redistribute fire, and reinforce weakened sectors. Discipline was their armor, endurance their weapon, and each soldier responded with practiced precision, the collective will of the regiment resisting the tide of enemy fire. The enemy advanced in coordinated waves, figures emerging from smoke and debris, bayonets glinting, laser guns firing in disciplined volleys. Eric directed his men with exacting authority, ensuring weak points were covered, maneuvers calculated, and each soldier positioned to withstand the onslaught. The trench line became a crucible of endurance, fear, and fatigue pressed to the limits, and yet Krieg's sons fought with grim determination. In the midst of battle, Eric's mind turned briefly to the younger soldiers. One pale-faced recruit, barely more than a boy, crouched trembling behind the parapet. Eric knelt beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Focus on your training," he whispered. "Fear is natural, but it cannot control you. Let discipline guide you. You are Krieg's sons. Remember that." The boy swallowed hard, nodded, and returned to the line, resolve flickering like a fragile flame through terror. Hours merged into one another as the engagement continued. Shells exploded across the frozen terrain, mud and blood mixed across the trenches, and soldiers fell beside each other, some never to rise again. Eric moved tirelessly, issuing orders, plugging gaps, and silently mourning the fallen. Each loss pressed upon him, a weight of command that could not be shaken. Yet amidst the chaos, small acts of bravery and loyalty shone like sparks, binding the regiment together and sustaining them through exhaustion and despair. As dusk fell, the enemy's advance finally faltered. The trench line, though battered and bloodied, held firm. Soldiers tended to wounds, reinforced defenses, and whispered quiet words of solace. Eric moved among them, noting exhaustion etched into every face, the quiet pride of those who had survived another day of endless trial. Night descended, carrying a bitter wind that cut through trenches and tents alike. Soldiers huddled for warmth, some in pairs, others alone, contemplating the day's losses. Eric retreated to his tent, boots caked with mud, armor streaked with dried blood. He reviewed maps and reports, tracing enemy movements, recalculating positions, preparing for the next inevitable wave. Doubts gnawed at him, the cost of loyalty, the lives claimed by duty, the shadow of fear for the young men under his command. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of artillery, the cries of wounded soldiers, and the relentless cadence of war. Eric closed his eyes, the weight of command settling deep into his bones. Tomorrow would bring more blood, more mud, more sacrifice. And still, he would rise, leading his men through the storm, because Krieg demanded endurance, and the sons of Krieg would not falter, even when the world itself seemed determined to break them. The battlefield awoke in a twilight of fire and smoke, the horizon jagged with ruined spires and shattered trees. Colonel Erich Stahl moved along the trench line, boots heavy with mud and frozen blood, eyes scanning the broken terrain with a calculating intensity. The regiment stirred around him, soldiers preparing for the assault that intelligence had warned of. A coordinated strike designed to crush the eastern defenses and shatter Krieg's hold. Faces were pale beneath mud and soot, but the discipline of Krieg ran deeper than fear. Every man knew his place, every action dictated by training and duty. Reports from forward scouts came in rapidly, detailing enemy movements that suggested cunning beyond brute force. Their formations shifted with unnerving precision, probing weak points and drawing the regiment into a deadly rhythm of engagement and counterattack. Eric absorbed the information quickly, adjusting the defensive strategy, recalculating lines, and issuing orders with measured authority. Each decision carried the weight of countless lives, and he bore it as silently as the frozen mud bore the footprints of the fallen. As dawn broke fully, the first artillery salvo erupted, tearing chunks of frozen earth into the air and shattering the fragile morning silence. Soldiers pressed themselves against the trench walls, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning for the advancing enemy. Eric moved along the parapet, issuing commands with calm precision, reinforcing exposed sectors and ensuring that every squad understood its role. The men responded with disciplined efficiency, the collective will of Krieg standing firm against the relentless tide of the assault. The enemy advanced in waves, emerging from smoke and shattered terrain, bayonets glinting, laser guns firing in unyielding volleys. Eric directed his men with tactical exactness, coordinating fire, sealing breaches, and moving reinforcements to threatened sectors. Each clash became a crucible, testing courage, endurance, and the limits of human resolve. Amid the chaos, the younger soldiers, recruits still barely acquainted with the horrors of war, found strength in the quiet presence of their commander, absorbing lessons of discipline and endurance through example. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last, filled with explosions, the stench of blood and smoke, and the relentless rhythm of gunfire. Soldiers fell beside one another, some never to rise again. Eric moved tirelessly among them, issuing orders, plugging gaps, and silently acknowledging the weight of every lost life. Yet even in the darkest moments, acts of loyalty and courage emerged. A soldier shielding a comrade, a veteran steadying a terrified recruit. Tiny sparks in a world of mud and blood that reminded him of why Krieg endured. As dusk approached, the enemy mounted a desperate final assault, pushing with fervent aggression against the eastern trench. Eric stood atop the parapet, directing every volley, repositioning squads, and calculating the most effective counters. The tension was almost tangible, the air heavy with anticipation, fear, and the unspoken knowledge that the coming night could bring irreversible loss. It was then that betrayal struck. From a forward position, a contingent of Krieg's own men hesitated, faltering under pressure in a critical moment, allowing enemy forces to breach a section of the parapet. Eric's eyes narrowed, heart constricting with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He moved swiftly to restore the line, rallying the remaining men, his voice cutting through the chaos with authority and fire. Trust had been violated in the most brutal of ways, and the consequences were immediate. Lives lost, positions endangered, and the regiment's endurance tested like never before. Amid the fight, Eric confronted the deserters, those who had faltered. Words were unnecessary. The gaze, the authority, and the unyielding discipline of Krieg were enough to demand recognition of their failure. Some returned to the line, shame and fear etched into their faces. Others paid the price, their hesitation condemned by the unforgiving code that had forged the sons of Krieg. Night fell like a shroud, the battlefield quiet but scarred, trenches broken and littered with the fallen. Soldiers tended wounds, reinforced defenses, and whispered in low voices of the day's horrors. Eric walked among them, surveying the damage, counting the losses, and noting the resilience that remained. The betrayal had cut deep, but the regiment endured, tempered by fire, mud, and the weight of unbroken will. Alone in his tent, Eric studied the maps, tracing enemy positions and reflecting on the choices that had led to this moment. The betrayal still burned in his mind, a reminder that loyalty was fragile and discipline absolute. Yet he understood that tomorrow would demand endurance once more, that the sons of Krieg would rise again, and that leadership required not only command, but the strength to bear the weight of every choice, every life, and every sacrifice. Outside, the wind carried the distant echoes of artillery and the whispers of the fallen. Eric closed his eyes, letting the gravity of command settle deep into his bones. Tomorrow would bring more mud, more blood, more trials. And still he would rise, standing amidst the storm because Krieg demanded it, because the sons of Krieg would not falter, and because the world would not bend to weakness. The battlefield lay under a heavy, ashen sky, a landscape of frozen mud, shattered parapets, and the lingering scent of smoke and blood. Colonel Erich Stahl moved through the trenches with calculated steps, each one a reminder of the relentless toll the war had taken. The regiment, battered and weary, prepared for the enemy's final push. A coordinated offensive that sought to break Krieg's lines once and for all. Faces were pale, eyes hollow yet determined, each soldier moving with the unyielding discipline that had become their armor against fear and despair. Reports arrived continuously from forward scouts. Enemy formations had shifted again, exploiting weaknesses, testing responses, probing the eastern sector with lethal precision. Intelligence suggested an imminent assault designed to shatter morale and claim the regiment's heart. Eric absorbed each report, tracing movements across maps streaked with frost, blood, and mud. Every line represented lives under his command, every decision a balance between survival and annihilation. As dawn approached, the first artillery salvo shattered the fragile silence, sending clods of frozen earth and ice into the air. Soldiers pressed themselves against trench walls, rifles ready, breath shallow and synchronized with the rhythm of the bombardment. Eric moved along the parapet, issuing rapid commands to counterflank, redistribute fire, and reinforce threatened sectors. The discipline of Krieg held, even as the weight of exhaustion and fear pressed upon every man. The enemy advanced in relentless waves, figures emerging from smoke and shattered terrain, bayonets glinting, lasguns firing with mechanical precision. Eric directed the regiment with calculated authority, ensuring every weak point was shored up, every maneuver synchronized, and every soldier positioned to resist the assault. Each clash became a test of endurance, courage, and will. The trench line a crucible where fear, loyalty, and duty collided. In the midst of the chaos, Eric's thoughts turned to the recruits, young faces pale beneath mud-smeared respirators, gripping rifles too large for their frames. He knelt beside one trembling boy, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Discipline guides you, not fear," he whispered. "Remember who you are. You are Krieg's sons." The boy swallowed, nodded, and returned to his position, with a flicker of resolve shining through his terror. Hours passed in a blur of motion and fire. Shells tore through the frozen landscape, mud and blood mixing across the trenches, soldiers falling beside one another, some never to rise again. Eric moved tirelessly, issuing orders, plugging gaps, and silently acknowledging every life lost. Yet even amid devastation, moments of loyalty and courage emerged. A soldier shielding a comrade, a veteran steadying a terrified recruit, sparks of light in a world of mud and blood. The enemy mounted a desperate final push as the day reached its zenith, attempting to exploit breaches and fracture the regiment's cohesion. Eric stood atop the parapet, directing fire, repositioning squads, and calculating the most effective counters. The tension was almost tangible, the air thick with anticipation and fear, every heartbeat echoing the fragility of survival. It was then that betrayal struck with devastating clarity. A contingent of Krieg's own men, exhausted and fearful, faltered at a critical juncture, allowing enemy forces to breach a section of the trench. Eric's eyes narrowed, a surge of rage and disbelief coiling within him. He moved swiftly to restore the line, rallying the remaining soldiers, his voice cutting through chaos with authority and fire. Trust had been violated, and the consequences were immediate. Lives lost, positions endangered, and the regiment's endurance tested as never before. Amid the desperate fighting, Eric confronted the deserters, those who had faltered. Words were unnecessary. The weight of command, the unyielding discipline of Krieg, and the grim gaze of their leader demanded recognition of failure. Some returned to the line, shame etched into their faces. Others paid the ultimate price, their hesitation condemned by the unforgiving code that had forged Krieg's sons. As night fell, the battlefield quieted, trenches scarred and littered with the fallen. Soldiers tended wounds, reinforced defenses, and whispered in low voices of the day's horrors. Eric walked among them, noting the resilience that remained despite betrayal and loss. The regiment had endured, tested by fire, mud, and shattered trust, yet remained unbroken, a testament to discipline and will. Alone in his tent, Eric reviewed maps and reports, tracing enemy positions, reflecting on the choices that had led to this moment. Betrayal, courage, sacrifice, all coexisted within the regiment, shaping the outcome of the day. The weight of command settled deep into his bones. Yet he understood that tomorrow would demand more endurance, more sacrifice, more resolve. The sons of Krieg would rise again, and he would lead them, because to falter was impossible, and to survive was the only duty. Outside, the wind carried distant artillery, the whispers of the fallen, and the unending cadence of war. Eric closed his eyes, letting the gravity of command settle, knowing that the ultimate confrontation loomed, that the decisions made tonight would ripple through the regiment and echo far beyond the frozen trenches. The sky hung low over the battlefield, a heavy, oppressive grey that seemed to press upon every living soul. Colonel Eric Stahl stood atop the parapet, surveying the trenches stretched before him, trenches scarred by countless battles, littered with the fallen, and etched with the memories of sacrifices that no words could honour. The wind carried the acrid scent of smoke and blood, cutting through his greatcoat, whispering of the endless cycle of war that had defined the lives of Krieg's sons for generations. The regiment moved with quiet determination, their pale faces drawn and eyes hollow but steadfast. Every soldier bore the weight of exhaustion, every breath measured against the demands of survival. They had endured betrayals, relentless assaults, and the ceaseless grind of obedience. Yet still, discipline held them, the unbreakable bond of Krieg shaping their every motion. Eric's gaze swept over the men, noting the subtle signs of strain and resilience alike, understanding that the next hours would test not just their bodies, but the very core of their will. Reports from scouts were grim but expected. Enemy forces had reorganized for one final assault, coordinated and precise, aiming to shatter the trench lines and claim the battlefield once and for all. Eric studied the maps with meticulous care, tracing movements, calculating odds, and planning countermeasures. Every decision carried the weight of lives, every choice a potential difference between survival and annihilation. The enormity of command settled over him like a shroud, yet he bore it without hesitation, knowing that leadership demanded endurance even when the world itself seemed determined to break him. As dawn broke, artillery shells tore through the frozen landscape, ripping clods of mud and ice into the air. Soldiers pressed themselves against the trench walls, rifles ready, eyes scanning the advancing enemy with grim resolve. Eric moved along the parapet, issuing orders with precision, reinforcing weak points and steadying the resolve of every man under his command. Each volley of fire, each maneuver executed under extreme duress, became a testament to the unyielding will of Krieg's sons. The enemy advanced in waves, figures emerging through smoke and debris, bayonets glinting, laser guns firing in disciplined volleys. Eric directed the regiment with unwavering authority, coordinating fire, shoring up breaches, and ensuring every soldier knew their role. The trenches became a crucible, testing courage, loyalty, and endurance. Soldiers fought side by side, shielding one another, sustaining each other in moments when despair threatened to overwhelm. Hours bled into one another, the clash of steel and las fire punctuated by the cries of the fallen. Eric moved tirelessly among the trenches, issuing orders, reinforcing gaps, and silently mourning the losses. Each casualty was a weight upon his shoulders, yet even in the bleakness, moments of loyalty and bravery illuminated the darkness. A soldier shielding a comrade, a veteran steadying a recruit, fleeting sparks that reminded him why Krieg endured. As the final enemy wave surged, Eric made a choice that would define the day. Positioning himself where he could command the entire line, he coordinated a counter-assault with precise timing, rallying every remaining man. Discipline and endurance converged into a singular force, and the enemy advance faltered, their formation breaking against the unyielding resistance. The battle reached its apex, a convergence of strategy, courage, and willpower, where every action mattered and every life was weighed against the cost of survival. Night fell slowly, the battlefield silent but scarred, trenches strewn with the fallen, and the echoes of violence still lingering in the frozen air. Soldiers tended wounds, reinforced defenses, and shared quiet moments of solace. Eric walked among them, noting their resilience, their exhaustion, and the quiet pride in having endured. Betrayals had been confronted, sacrifices honored, and courage tested beyond measure. The regiment had survived, tempered by fire, mud, and unbroken will. In the solitude of his tent, Eric reflected on the cost of command, the lives lost, the decisions made, the betrayals endured, and the endurance required to lead. Immortality was a concept far removed from the frozen trenches of Krieg. Yet the legacy of those who survived, who endured, was eternal in the echoes of duty and sacrifice. The battlefield, scarred and silent, bore witness to the unyielding resolve of men who had fought not for glory, but for survival, for honor, and for the relentless demands of their empire. Outside, the wind whispered through broken parapets, carrying with it the scent of blood, smoke, and the unbroken rhythm of Krieg's sons. Eric closed his eyes, letting the weight of command settle into his bones, knowing that the battle was won, but the war continued in cycles beyond any single lifetime. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the trenches in crimson light, a final reminder of the cost of duty, the inevitability of sacrifice, and the enduring strength of those who would rise again, unbroken, to face the endless war. The empire of Krieg endured, not through invincibility, but through the resilience, discipline, and unyielding will of its soldiers. Their legacy was carved into mud and blood, etched in memory and steel, a testament to the cost of loyalty and the endurance of humanity amidst the relentless tides of war.